Did the week before just solve FNAF 1's timeline mystery once and for all? And why did so many fans miss it? In today's video, we're taking a closer look at the week before and uncovering its surprising revelations about the FNAF 1 timeline that many fans have overlooked. If you've ever been confused about where the events of FNAF 1 actually take place, stick around because we've got some major insights that could change everything you thought you knew about the timeline. Before we jump in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more FNAF theories and updates. Let's get started. The recently released Five Nights at Freddy's book The Week Before offers new lore and clues that add depth to the FNAF universe, especially regarding the first FNAF game. This book strikes a delicate balance between providing enough details to expand upon our current theories while leaving enough space for enjoyable speculation. Since the book's release, theorists have scrambled to decode the hidden hints it offers, and one of the major points of debate is the timeline of FNAF 1. FNAF 1's timeline, what we thought we knew. Before the release of The Week Before, it was widely accepted that FNAF 1 took place in 1993. This date was derived from the original FNAF game theory video by MatPat, who linked the game's story to a real-life tragedy in 1993. Over the years, this date became entrenched in the FNAF lore, despite the emergence of alternative theories suggesting that the game could have taken place in 1992 or 1994. Some even speculated that the book might reveal that the game occurred in the late 90s or early 2000s, especially considering the FNAF movie's timeline, which is set in the early 2000s. However, some fans have argued that this reasoning might be misguided, as The Week Before seems to suggest that FNAF 1 might take place much earlier than we originally thought. The book provides subtle but significant hints that could alter our understanding of the timeline. 90s evidence, key clues leading us toward 1995. The first significant piece of evidence that fans point to when arguing that The Week Before supports a 1990s timeline comes from the phone call system in the game. Toward the end of the night, one in FNAF 1, the player can interact with a phone on the desk, which leads to a choice between calling backstage, calling home, or accessing voicemail. If the player chooses the voicemail option, an automated voice asks for a 4-digit access code. The player is unable to find the code on night 1, and must return later in the game to input it. If the player succeeds in accessing the voicemail, they hear a message recorded by Ralph, the book's protagonist, welcoming the new night guard. The message states that Ralph's daughter, Capellia, is 11 years old and turning 12 next month. This is where fans start connecting the dots. If Capellia is 12 in the year the book takes place, then based on the timeline established by the FNAF universe, the game must occur in 1995, 12 years after 1983, the year Freddy Fazbear's Pizza first opened. This piece of information initially seems to confirm a 1995 timeline for FNAF 1. But as we dig deeper, we realize that there are more clues in the book that complicate this theory. The reopening of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a more recent timeline. In addition to the voicemail message, The Week Before provides further evidence that the timeline could be earlier than 1995. At the start of the book, Ralph is introduced as a longtime employee who usually works the day shift. However, due to a staff vacancy and the temporary closure of the pizzeria, he is asked to take the night shift for a week. This ties into a reference from FNAF 2, where Ralph the phone guy tells Jeremy Fitzgerald that the pizzeria is closing due to whatever happened in FNAF 2. While The Week Before shows us Ralph working as the night guard for just 1 week, many fans have assumed that Ralph must have worked at Freddy's for a longer period before the events of FNAF 1. However, the book emphasizes that the pizzeria's reopening is a recent event. Several references are made to Freddy's being amid a comeback, as the animatronics have just been restored to their classic unwithered look. If the pizzeria had been open for years, the idea of a recent reopening would feel out of place. As the book progresses, Ralph comments on how the animatronics, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, are behaving aggressively, which is noted as unusual. The mention of this behavior and the pizzeria's reopening ties into the idea that the location has only just begun to operate again, potentially after a significant hiatus. Foxy, in particular, is noted as being out of order, and his attraction has only just been marked as reopened. This implies that the timeline of FNAF 1 could take place very soon after Freddy's reopening, possibly in the early 90s. On page 50 of the book, Ralph makes a phone call to 911 after a series of frightening incidents. The 911 operator, when learning that Ralph is at Freddy's, reacts with surprise, stating, "Freddy's? I thought they closed up after that." This is a clear indication that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has only recently reopened, making it unlikely that FNAF 1 will take place in the mid-90s, as some have suggested. The Bite of 87 and the recent reopening, more evidence against 1995. A significant piece of FNAF lore that seems to be tied to the timeline of FNAF 1 is the infamous Bite of 87. In the week before, there's a scene where Ralph repairs Bonnie, but fails to secure one of his screws properly, leading to an accident. The next day, Ralph receives a call from his boss, Mrs. Aton, who mentions that the company had its biggest crowd in a long time, and a reporter was present to cover the reopening of the pizzeria. This reinforces the idea that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has only recently reopened, which conflicts with the idea of a 1995 timeline. If the pizzeria had been operating for over a decade, it would be odd to refer to the biggest crowd in a long time as part of a comeback story. The continued references to the reopening of Freddy's throughout the book suggest that FNAF 1 occurred much earlier than 1995. It seems more likely that the game takes place in the early 80s, perhaps even in 1987, the year of the Bite of 87, which is often connected to Foxy in the FNAF lore. Everyone's got it wrong. Cheating and timeline manipulation in the book. There's one final point of contention regarding the timeline of the week before, the issue of cheating. Throughout the book, players are given choices that impact the course of the story. However, certain choices and items are inaccessible without breaking the rules of the book. For example, on night 4, the player can find a green ticket with a code on it, 2114, which seems to reference the year the first FNAF game came out in the universe. This ticket, however, isn't available until later in the book, creating a timeline discrepancy. This issue highlights that not all pages in the week before are accessible in the correct order, suggesting that the timeline may not be as straightforward as fans initially assumed. The manipulation of these choices may be a deliberate attempt to confuse players, adding another layer of mystery to the overall timeline of FNAF 1. The Age of Capellia, a major mistake. One of the most glaring issues in the week before revolves around Capellia, Ralph's daughter. In one section of the book, Capellia is described as being a newborn. However, this poses a significant issue because later in the story, it's revealed that she was brought to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza when she was 7 years old. This creates a contradiction. Is Capellia a newborn, or is she 7? This discrepancy has led many to call it a glitch, a mistake that somehow slipped through the editing process. At first glance, this seems like a clear error in continuity. However, I believe this could be a remnant of an earlier draft before the ages of the characters and the timeline had been fully established. The mistake might have been left over from a version of the book where Capellia's age wasn't as clearly defined. The mention of her being a newborn could be a simple mistake, carried over from when the storyline had Capellia at a much younger age. In this case, the error could have been easily overlooked during editing, leaving us with this odd reference. A deeper look at the timeline and the code. Despite this oversight, there's another important detail to consider: the reference to the voicemail code. In night 1 of the book, the character Ralph enters a code, but the code is never explicitly referenced. Instead, Ralph simply enters the code and listens to a recording. This would initially seem like a missing piece of information, but upon further investigation, it seems like there may be a more nuanced explanation. In researching the book, I discovered a critical detail. On the 6th night, the game offers the player the chance to restart with a bonus item. The bonus item plays a pivotal role in several parts of the book. In fact, throughout the narrative, you are prompted to use this bonus item multiple times. This becomes particularly significant on night 1, when Ralph uses his mobile phone to record a message. This recording ultimately leads to a voicemail system, which players can only access by using the bonus item. The book makes a curious reference. It suggests that the voicemail code is programmed into the phone's speed dial. When I first encountered this, I thought I had debunked my theory. Perhaps this was not an error after all. But upon closer reflection, I realized something crucial. The voicemail system doesn't explicitly reference the bonus item in any of its messages. It's only when the player skips the opportunity to use the voicemail system that the bonus item becomes available to access the code. This inconsistency further suggests that the voicemail system was likely left over from an earlier draft of the book and was not properly updated in the final version. A hidden error, contradictions in the narrative. There's another passage in the book that reinforces the idea that the week before might be riddled with small errors that were not adequately addressed in editing. In one scene, Ralph mentions that he didn't take the night shift because Capellia had just been born. This would contradict a later passage in the book where it stated that Capella was brought to Freddy's when she was 7. This is a significant contradiction, and it makes it even more likely that the earlier draft of the story was not fully harmonized with the final version. The issue becomes even more apparent when comparing this passage to a similar one later on night 4. On night 4, Ralph listens to a message from the phone guy, and he reflects on the situation with a slightly altered perspective. The same themes from earlier in the book are present, but the language has evolved. The passage from night 2 feels more straightforward, whereas night 4's passage contains more nuanced details, suggesting a refinement in the story's direction. This could be a sign that the original draft, which included the error about Capellia's birth, was hastily included in the final version. The pop culture clues. Why 1989 makes sense. When attempting to pin down the exact timeline of FNAF 1, we must consider the numerous references to pop culture scattered throughout the week before. Ralph, the protagonist, often quips about movies and books that were popular in the 1980s. The sheer number of references to works like The Goonies, Dirty Harry, Bruce Willis and Die Hard, and Lord of the Rings suggests a specific cultural moment in time. One thing is certain, these references indicate the story takes place in the late 1980s, not the 1990s, as many fans might have initially assumed. Some of the references in the book include specific mentions of Lethal Weapon 2 released in 1989, and the Sega Genesis, which was also launched in North America in 1989. Even the character of Capellia plays games on the Sega Genesis console. Given that these references all point to the late 1980s, it seems increasingly likely that the week before is set in 1989. The absence of any pop culture references from the 1990s further supports this notion. The critical evidence, the Capellia and Fredbear connection. The strongest piece of evidence that places FNAF 1 in 1989 comes from a key scene involving Capellia. In the novel, Capellia recalls her first experience with the animatronics at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. She remembers being terrified by Fredbear, an animatronic from the earlier days of the franchise. This is significant because Fredbear's family diner was the predecessor to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and it was in operation before the events of FNAF 1. Ralph explicitly mentions that Capella was brought to Freddy's when she was 7, which would place her visit in 1985. This directly ties the events of the week before to the time around the 1985 incident involving the Springlock suits. The timeline, when examined carefully, fits with all the pop culture clues as well as the ages of the characters, leading us to conclude that the story occurs in 1989. The importance of Fredbear and Springlock suits. The mention of Fredbear and the Springlock suits in the narrative offers strong support for the timeline of FNAF 1, further solidifying its connection to events that unfolded in the mid-1880s. The Springlock suits, which were used in the earlier days of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, were retired after a tragic incident in 1985. This is significant because the Springlock incident occurred right around the same time as the infamous Missing Children's Incident, MCI, which is a major event in the FNAF universe. Capellia, Ralph's daughter, is said to have visited Freddy's on her 7th birthday, which places her visit in 1985. This visit, which took place just before the Springlock incident, is important because it helps us pinpoint a precise moment in the timeline. Given that Capellia's birthday would have been in December 1985, this timing suggests that she was exposed to the terrifying animatronics and the Springlock suits shortly before their retirement. The fact that Capellia refers to Fredbear, an animatronic that was retired along with the Springlock suits, is key. Fredbear's presence in the narrative is notable because, despite the animatronics from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza being prominent in later years, Fredbear was largely forgotten by the public after 1983. Capellia's connection to Fredbear isn't just a coincidence. It's a meaningful part of her early childhood. Her familiarity with the animatronic suggests it played a significant role in her life. From what we know, Capellia visited Freddy's in 1985, which means her 8th birthday likely happened in December of that year. This timeline helps us figure out that the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 1 happened a few years later, probably around 1989. The timing makes sense when you consider other references in the story. For example, pop culture nods like Lethal Weapon 2 and the Sega Genesis both came out in 1989, which lines up perfectly with the suggested date. These little clues work together with Capellia's age and the context of events like the Springlock incident to confirm that FNAF 1 is set in 1989. It's a detail that adds depth to the timeline, showing how tightly everything is connected. Another important point is how the book ties back to 1985, even more than many fans might have noticed at first. The timeline seems to revolve around that year and the events surrounding it, like the Springlock incident and the Missing Children's Incident, MCI. These events create a foundation for the story, which then moves forward a few years to when Freddy Fazbear's Pizza reopened and FNAF 1 takes place. What's interesting is how this timeline shifts the focus from the early 1990s, where some fans initially placed the story, to the late 1980s. It's a small but important adjustment that makes everything fit together more smoothly. The connections between Capellia's childhood, the pop culture of the time, and the animatronics show how carefully the timeline has been woven. Overall, the evidence strongly supports 1989 as the year for FNAF 1, making it a key moment in the larger narrative. It's fascinating to see how these little details, like Capellia's birthday and cultural references, all come together to paint a clearer picture of the timeline. The late 80s feel like the perfect backdrop for the eerie events at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. 1989 is the key year after going through all the clues and contradictions in the week before. It seems pretty clear that the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 1 are set in 1989. Yes, the book has its share of errors, like the mistake about Capellia's birth and some confusion over the voicemail code. But the bigger picture still points to this timeline. When you piece together the pop culture references, the details about Capellia's timeline, and the information about the Springlock suits, they all seem to fit the late 80s vibe perfectly. So, 1989 makes the most sense as the setting. Now, as for the book itself, fans have definitely noticed the inconsistencies, and it wouldn't be surprising if future editions address some of these issues. Maybe they'll fix the errors with the voicemail system, or clear up the timeline for Capellia's birth. It would be great to have those questions finally answered in a re-release or updated version of the book. For now, though, we can feel pretty confident about the timing. The book's events seem to take place 2 years after the infamous Bite of '87, during a time when Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was back in business. This was before everything went completely downhill, but the cracks in the story were already forming. It's exciting to think about how future updates or additions might fill in these gaps. Until then, fans can still enjoy debating and theorizing over the details. The timeline of the FNAF universe has always been a bit of a puzzle, and part of the fun is trying to piece it all together. But one thing seems pretty solid. 1989 is when the spooky events of FNAF 1 went down, errors and all. In the world of FNAF, the timeline can be complex and often contradictory, but careful analysis reveals patterns that help us understand the broader picture. By looking at the clues in the week before and connecting them with the known events of the FNAF universe, we can piece together a timeline that feels both logical and compelling. And as always, we welcome open discourse on these theories. After all, that's what makes FNAF fan theories so much fun. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the week before and FNAF 1's timeline, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Did you catch these details, or was this new info to you? Don't forget to subscribe for more FNAF theories. See you next time.